Welcome to our Building Bridges webinar. This is the final webinar before our flagship annual event, which will be taking place in 3 weeks from now in Geneva, kicking off on 30th of September, 3 action-filled days until the end of Thursday, October 2nd. We hope to welcome many of you in person, and please visit our website, www.buildingbridges.org, for more information. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our Building Bridges website on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to watch again, share it widely, and keep the conversation going. We'll also have a Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat. So I'm Christine Wallier, Head of Strategic Partnerships at Building Bridges, and on behalf of our foundation, we would like to welcome you to today's session, where we'll be exploring how private markets are powering the energy transition to obviously the net zero transition. We have a fantastic lineup of experts today, and we also will be examining this topic in Building Bridges in 3 weeks. So definitely a very important and integral topic that will be explored more further in our conference. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to today's moderator, Barbara Buchner. She's the Global Executive Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI. If you don't know Barbara, you should know Barbara. She's internationally recognized as one of the most influential leaders in climate finance. She has over 2 decades of experience advising governments, financial institutions, and philanthropic organizations, and on how to mobilize capital, very importantly, mobilizing capital to scale climate and development solutions. She's the lead author of the Global Landscape for Climate Finance, which is the sector's benchmark report to track climate financial flows. She's also one of the 20 most influential women by Business Insider. So with that, I pass the floor to Barbara. I wish us a very insightful exchange, and thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you so much, Christine, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. It's such a pleasure to moderate this discussion, how private markets are powering the energy transition to fuel net zero. I think we all know that the scale of investment required for the global energy transition is large. Recent findings from my organization, CPI, and Christine just mentioned it, our Global Landscape of Climate Finance 2025, put this into sharp perspective. But let's start with the good news. Our work shows that global climate finance flows hit an all-time high of $1.9 trillion in 2023, more than doubling in 3 years. And private finance crossed the $1 trillion threshold for the first time. In fact, between 2021 and 23, climate finance grew by an average of 26% per year, 26%. And if this pace continues, the world could meet $6 trillion in annual climate investment, which is the most conservative estimate of global needs by 2028. But, big but, while the increase, of course, is very promising, a significant gap remains between current investment and what's needed to achieve global climate goals and seize the opportunities that the low carbon transition presents. In fact, the lower bound of global estimated climate finance needs is still 3 times more than current flows. And we all know that if we are to close, or when we are to close the gap, and in particular double global energy investment, then private capital must be scaled, must be mobilized far beyond today's levels. And within this picture, equity plays a uniquely important role. Equity is not just a direct source of financing, it's also a key enabler that can unlock additional debt capital. However, our analysis again shows that equity deployment into energy transition infrastructure in emerging markets, in developing economies, has remained very limited. Out of $1 trillion that I just mentioned, only about $60 billion per year of equity is flowing into this market. So it's a tiny fraction of what is required. And this creates what we call the equity financing gap. Why does this matter? Because emerging markets are where energy demand is growing fastest and where the transition will determine whether we succeed or whether we fail globally. But these are also the markets where risks are perceived to be highest and where investors need stronger signals to commit capital. Again, I want to focus on some of the good news, which is that there are highly effective tools for closing this equity gap. And one of the most powerful is catalytic equity, which is equity deployed in sub-market terms to mobilize other investors. Our joint analysis with partners, including G-Funds, Allied Climate Partners, Recurrence Group, and Wood Mackenzie, shows that catalytic equity can be transformative and has a significant potential to mobilize additional capital. And that means that relatively modest amounts of catalytic equity, if well targeted, can unlock very large sums of private capital. And all this brings us now directly to the purpose of today's conversation. Private markets, private equity, infrastructure funds, institutional investors have the capital, they have the flexibility and the innovation needed to power the energy transition. The question is how to best direct capital, how to manage risk and highlight returns, and how to align with the policy frameworks that make investments scalable. So today, we have a fantastic group of leaders across the investment spectrum to share perspective on where the opportunities lie, where risks are being managed, in which way, and what policy frameworks can accelerate goals and progress. So please let me briefly introduce our panelists, and then let's get started with our first round of discussion. And let me introduce first Kimberly Tan, who is the head of investments at GenZero. Kimberly, great to have you. And let me also introduce François-Xavier Vucekovic, who is the Chief Investment Officer of Edmond de Rothschild Private Equity. Welcome to you as well. Let me also introduce Alex Ouimet-Storrs, who is the Investment Director for Plastic Circularity Strategy at Lombard Odier Investment Management. And last but certainly not least, let me welcome Kayode Akinolo, who is the head of private equity at Blue Earth Capital. So let's start and get right into the discussion here. And Kimberly, let me start with you. We also in our work see very clearly that Asia is leading the transition, and Singapore certainly is standing out there. So GenZero obviously is known for very innovative approaches to carbon markets and decarbonization more broadly. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit more what role carbon credits play in accelerating that energy transition. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for having me and for the kind words about GenZero. So just to take a step back, what are carbon credits? Right? And I don't need to go into a long 101, but at its core, carbon credits are a financial instrument. Right, so they monetize carbon reductions and removals, and they are a fairly well-established pathway. Right, they've been around since the Kyoto Protocol, since the days of the CDM. And what they do is that by so monetizing carbon reductions and removals, they improve project economics, right, and they help projects go from unbankable to bankable. Right, they also transfer finance, right, from corporates frequently in developed markets to deserving climate projects frequently in the global south. Right, and I think if we take a step back and think about what the CDM and carbon credits have done for the energy transition in Asia, they played a major role, right, in the financing of wind and hydropower projects, which did contribute meaningfully, right, to GHG reduction in China and India. Although I guess with the CDM there were some concerns around additionality, right, which brings us to today. Right, and specific to our part of the world in Southeast Asia, at GenZero, we've been actively pushing for the use of carbon credits today to drive the energy transition, and in particular, the phase out of coal-fired power plants in Southeast Asia. And why are we doing this, right? Coal-fired power plants seem quite anachronistic in many parts of the world, right? I think in the UK, in many parts, it's no longer quite as much of an issue because of the age of the fleet. But I think in Asia, and this is a huge problem, right? Because coal-fired power plants in Asia contribute about 1 of every 7 tons of CO2 that's emitted globally today. Right? And they will continue doing so because the fleet is young, right? So the average age of the coal-fired power plant in Asia is about 13 to 15 years compared to a useful life of 40 to 50 years, which means that if we don't do anything about it, these plants will continue emitting, right, for the next 25 years, 30 years. And so if we look at Southeast Asia, what are we trying to do here? I think if we phase out coal-fired power plants just in Southeast Asia, that will be 600 million tons of CO2 less per year, right? Even if you just look at a single power plant, right? 70% of plants in Southeast Asia emit more than 500,000 tons of CO2 per year. That's huge. You know, how many trees will you plant and on how many hectares of land, right, to achieve that kind of impact, right? So how can carbon credits help, right? At its simplest form, carbon credits, or what we call transition credits, can be sold to corporates for income, and this can be used to compensate owners and investors of existing coal-fired power plants for the lost value if we shut their plants down early. And the money that you collect from carbon credits can be used to support the deployment of clean energy that will have to replace the coal-fired power plants, and also to provide support for a just transition for those employed by the power plants. So that's something that we're piloting along with our partners, ACEN and Keppel. Right, we're piloting the use of carbon credits to bring forward the retirement of a 250 megawatt power plant in the south of Luzon in the Philippines. Right, and we're going to shut it down earlier, right, from 2040 to 2030, so 10 years earlier. And if you think about the impact that we hope to achieve with just this pilot plant, this plant emits 1.9 million tons of CO2 per year, right? So if you retire the plant earlier by 10 years, just imagine that's close to 20 million tons of CO2. And the revenue from these transition credits that we hope to sell to corporates, to countries, will then offset the lost income, right, for the owners of the power plant. And this can augment the use also of blended finance to lower the cost of borrowing. And by so doing, we hope to actually achieve this earlier retirement. Of course, it's easier said than done, right? And in order for this to work, we all need to be confident in the integrity of the credits. So meaning, I think it has to be quite clear that without the credits, the plants would otherwise continue operations. In other words, this capital needs to be additional, right? It needs to be permanent, right? We can't shut down the plant and then sell all these credits, and then, you know, in 2031 the plant starts operations against that would just be a disaster, right? And we have to avoid leakage, meaning the coal-fired power plant has to be replaced by a clean, renewable source of energy and not another coal plant. And if there is integrity in these credits, then there will be willingness to pay for these credits, and there will be demand for these credits. And the more there is this demand, the higher the pricing, the more we are then able to use carbon credits as a tool to bring forward the earlier retirement of many other coal plants in Southeast Asia. So that's the hope. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Such an important work. And again, I think it is really important to think more about not only how can we do more of the good, like more into renewable, but how can we really shift the way, particularly in countries and regions where there are younger fleets, as you pointed out, how can we shift the way and what are ways and tools of doing that? So I think it's fantastic to hear about that pilot. I certainly applaud that one. I think there's what we see in our work, there is actually several types of approaches and pilots going on, which is really important because I think we need to get this right. And I think focusing on the integrity of the credits and really how can we make sure that the markets and the investors believe that these are high quality credits, I think really important. And thanks also for mentioning the just piece of this transition, which I think is so important. I'm sure we'll get back to that. But Francois, let me come to you, Xavier, just understanding a little bit, you know, how you see and where you see the strongest risk adjusted returns and opportunities in this overarching energy transition space. And obviously also speaking a little bit from your experience as Edmond de Rothschild has a long track record in private equity. So let me hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for having me in this panel. So at Edmond de Rothschild, we have a long history in investing in private assets. The family invested, it was in the 19th century, in the first railway network in Europe. It was in the north of France. They invested into Canal de Suez. So they have this long-term approach to investment. And I would say this entrepreneurial approach where they want to bring finance to the service of the society, to the service of the industry. And this is based on this approach that we built actually our private equity platform 20 years ago. And when we started this private equity activity, we focused on key thematics, key challenges, again, where we can bring obviously returns, but also positive impacts for our society. So in a nutshell, who we are today, we manage more than 4 billion into different strategies across private real assets, emerging markets, more specifically Africa, and growth buyout thematic strategies. As you mentioned in your introduction, Barbara, there is a huge opportunity in energy transition. You mentioned a strong growth into investments in energy transition, but this is not sufficient. The needs are extremely important, and important to say that public bodies are not capable to finance at scale this transition, because and we all know that there is this high public indebtedness, there is public deficits, and so public bodies cannot finance. So we absolutely need private investors, institutional investors to foster actually this energy transition and to put it at scale. So we can see many market opportunities, because energy transition actually is a question of every sectors, from the upstream energy generation to energy distribution and to all type of sectors. So where we focus on, because we cannot do everything, we focus on the small and mid market, where we think there is a great opportunity to enter at good valuations into companies and projects. But more importantly, where we think that we can create a lot of value, because you can transform the assets. And when we are talking about infrastructure projects, we invest in what we call greenfield projects, where actually you have to build a new asset or to transform significantly an asset. And this is where you can bring a lot of value and to foster again the energy transition. We invest in different sectors or type of assets in energy generation, where we focus mainly on base load energy generation projects. We think it's important because when you see the development of solar, wind energy, you have a lot of intermittent energy coming to the grid, and this is extremely difficult to manage the grid with all this intermittent energy. So we think it's important to develop more local baseload energy generation projects. Solid biofuels, and I will share an example on that, is also an important topic for us. And everything which is related to mobility, we can see a huge transformation of mobility, especially in Europe, and this is also a sector we target. So maybe let me share with you a project, one of our latest investment in the energy infrastructure space. It's a company based in Norway. They have developed a unique technology actually to produce what we call black pellets from biomass. So we build cogeneration utilities. We use actually wood waste, from paper companies like that. And by heating this waste, we can produce black pellets. What is interesting with black pellets, it's a substitute of coal, basically. And actually, this is maybe a solution for Kimberly in Asia, but it's true that you have a lot of thermal power plants in Europe and other parts of the world. They use coal. They produce a lot of carbon emissions. And so you have two options. Either you close down these utilities, but then you don't have any energy production, or you can substitute coal with something which will be less carbon, which will have less carbon emissions. And with black pellet, actually, you have no carbon emission because you are using waste to produce these black pellets. Those black pellets have the same energy properties than coal. You can store it, you can transport them. So it's a very interesting technology actually to reduce again coal consumption into thermal power plants. And so we started with a pilot plant. It was in Norway, and now we are in the process of developing, internationalizing the company. We have many offtake contracts, especially in Europe. As I mentioned, also other opportunities in the mobility space. We focus on what we call hybrid infrastructure, where actually you can combine energy generation, digitalization, mobility services in one single project to really, I would say, transition transport more as a mobility as a service, which is a new framework we can see, especially in North America, but also coming into Europe. So I will stop there, but it's what we are looking at in the energy transition space.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And I think really important to showcase how you are thinking about adding a specific value in specific areas, and therefore I think managing to first go from pilots and then think about how can you replicate and get to scale. So I think and nice links already between you and what Kimberly is trying to do. I think this more holistic view of how can you really move away and accelerate the transition is really important. So fantastic to hear about those areas. And I think it brings me very nicely, Alex, to you actually, as we are, particularly also the last point around the hybrid infrastructure, how you're thinking more holistically about services, I think brings us a little bit to the concept of circularity, which is very often discussed alongside energy transition, but I think less understood by mainstream investors. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit, more information on the concept and how does circularity actually reduce emissions and create, again, opportunities, investable opportunities for private markets. So over to you.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. So just maybe take a step back to define circularity, because it's used a lot. And I mean, our definition, I think, is really, we're eliminating waste by keeping, materials and products for as long as possible in a loop, right? So eliminating kind of the take, make, dispose, which we use today, and try to really use, repair, remanufacturing, recycling to really create these closed loop systems, right? And on our side at, Lombard Odier, so I'm one of the team members of our plastic circularity fund. So Lombard has been investing in circularity for many years, and I'm, part of our investment management arm. And so we have about 100 million plastic circularity fund. So circularity is something that we eat, sleep, breathe, and I've, for every day. And I've been working as an investor, as a VC and also as a CVC in the chemical circularity and energy. I used to be an energy trader. So Kimberly, I can talk to you about when those carbon credits collapsed in 2008, 9, 10. It was horrible. So we can have a chat separately about that. But I have
It's
a few
not
more
great now
stories.
either, but okay.
I know,
yeah.
but it's okay. It'll come back. It'll come back. I'm with you on the need for them, but that's a separate topic. But so what we do is we really invest in plastic circularity. So I think it's 4% of global emissions are linked towards plastic production. In, for example, mobility that Francois was mentioning, plastics are a key component, right, for lightweighting and everything else. But the problem is they're made out of fossil fuels, and so they pollute the earth. There's a lot of issues, and when we talk about circularity on our side, keeping plastics in that closed loop, it can either be through recycling, right? So, you're looking at, 70, 80% less GHG emissions than virgin. You're looking at other applications, which are more B2C. So there's people that are, that refurbished electronics like Back Market, for example. Those are key solutions to keep these electronics outside of the landfill and inside, the closed loop. And we've invested ourselves in a company called 900.care, which is a French company doing, home and personal care products that are plastic free and water free. And that's literally taking like 80% of emissions out of, your typical home and personal care products. So really, and I think the key to investing in circularity, and I think this applies to energy and, climate tech in general, is you need to meet three key criteria. First is the solution actually sustainable? In some cases, actually, and I can think about hydrogen, I think probably there's some cases where it's really not sustainable at all. I worked in hydrogen as well at the beginning of my career. So you need to check if it's, first of all, a good idea from a sustainability perspective and the numbers matched via, LCAs and other stuff. Then I think the two other key components to meet, and I think this is how circularity is going to become mainstream, is you need to meet cost, right? So the example of our company, 900.care, which does water-free and plastic-free home and personal care products, these guys are able to get it at the cost point of a shampoo, right? So you get a little, how it works is you get a plastic bottle at the beginning, you subscribe online or you go to your grocery store and you get a little solid refill, you put it in, you add water, and then 5 hours later you get your, well, shampoo, not in my case, but shower gel, or, there's deodorant, there's all kinds of other solutions, right? And they need to be at cost parity, because the green premiums are nice, but when we invest, we try to look at, what's the cost? Can you make it? Can you make it to that mass market cost? And this is also, energy is also the same problem, right? And I think the third is performance, right? Which on circularity is very important. You want to have equal performance or better to what you're replacing from a fossil fuel perspective. So I'll go back to 900.care, our French company. They were ranked best shower gel in all of France by a major consumer institute. And they have the performance, right? So when you have those three criteria, you're setting yourself up for success. And what we need from a circularity perspective is really mass market, because, if you're too expensive or your performance isn't good, nobody's going to buy it. So I think that's what's really key. And it goes for recycling and everything else. You need to have products that are exactly the same as what you're getting normally. So I'll stop here. I don't know if you have any
Fantastic.
other. Yeah.
I for sure will come back to you, but I think it's so important what you said, because again, this is not supposed to be a nice, you know, a little nice kind of add-on. We need to make sure that this is mainstream business, and this is really something that, you know, everyone sees the opportunity. So I really appreciate you kind of very clearly outlining these 3 criteria, and I think it's something that, you know, we all should be very aware, because again, yes, at the very beginning, and we've heard about some blended finance from Kimberly, you know, to get some technologies to specific geographies, you will need some blended finance, or you may need some, you know, public money to get, you know, off the ground,
Yeah.
or like reduce the technology costs. But eventually you need to make sure that these solutions all are commercially viable. So I really appreciate your points,
Yeah, and you
Alex,
need to
here.
blend technical people with financial people, with government
Yes.
officials. You need all these people to talk, and corporates, because if they
Yes.
don't talk, right, you're never going to get there. And I think you said the key point is public funding, especially to de-risk and lower costs. That's very important as well.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phil. Kayode, let me come to you. I think we already heard a lot about like pilots here, pilots there, but obviously, ultimately, we want to go, you know, towards the industry scale. And so really, how do we do that? How do we scale some of these climate solutions to move from the small pilots to kind of the scale that we require? And in this context, what role can private equity play in really bridging that gap for some of these emerging technologies that are supporting decarbonization? So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. Look, I think in terms of the overarching underlying thematic here, I think Alex touched on it. It's all to do with cost, and it's all to do with the inverse correlation, right, between scale and cost. So I think there are really 3 key things for us to consider, which is 1, why scaling in decarbonization and the energy transition is so important. What are the key challenges? And there are, you know, quite a few. And then, as you say, what role can private equity play in that context? I think, as all of, or hopefully many who've joined this panel today or the conversation know, the energy transition and decarbonization is all about scale. All of the paths to net zero require, you know, pretty significant shifts away from the way things are done at the moment. So everything from how we make things, how we consume things, how we move goods and people, our dwellings, closed spaces, and also our industrial processes. And a big part of this is obviously switching to electrification. So using other sources other than fossil fuels, but also the development of alternative fuels. Alex mentioned hydrogen, but also then efficiency gains of existing operations. So it's not just about brand new stuff. I think sometimes when we think about climate, we're thinking about we can only invest in, you know, the latest, most cutting edge, newest thing, but it's also about looking at what we can do better and more efficiently with things that we have already. But no matter which way we come at it, scale is critically important. And with that comes some pretty significant challenges. As most of the solutions or the potential solutions, and in particular those that have new technologies, are currently not at scale. So if obviously if they were all at scale, we wouldn't have some of these challenges. But what that means is that whatever solutions or modifications we want to implement, they need to meet wide acceptance and utilization. And in other words, again, scale. So almost by definition, if you want to support things from pilot to industrial size, in some instances, you need to move pilots to first of a kind. And it's first of a kind plants, it's first of a kind installations, it's first of a kind operations of any sort at industrial scale. And the risks around that are the capital. So a lot of these things are actually quite capital intensive, and that is particularly relevant in the context of potential funding sources. The execution around it. So it's not enough that you have the technology, you can say it works, but you have to actually then go and build the installation, build the factory, scale the service. And that is not to be underestimated. And then the timing of this. How long does this take? I mean, in most people's experience, anyone who's ever set up a business or built anything, you know, knows the old saying that things tend to take longer and cost more than you think. And that certainly when you are taking a pilot project to something larger can often times be the case. And that has significant implications, obviously, on returns and cost of capital. But the other things around it that are sometimes not, you know, maybe not forgotten, but not in the foreground, are things that are associated to that scaling. So it's the plant also needs to get planned. You need to get approval. You need to actually get a workforce to do it. The consumers, whether it's B2B or B2C, they need to actually embrace the product. And then habits are hard to change. A lot of processes that we have right now have refined themselves over hundreds, sometimes longer years, to really get to lowest cost production levels. And if you try and shift that around, you're having to shift people's attitudes towards it. So what is needed, almost by definition again, is patient capital that's fit for purpose, and really can act as partnerships for these scaling ambitions. And that's important, especially when you look around the needs of growing businesses, because these businesses have different cash flow profiles and different cash flow requirements. So if we know scaling is important, if we know what some of the challenges are, private equity, just by nature of some of the characteristics inherent in private equity, it's can be longer term, it is flexible, you can structure it, it's not reliant on immediate cash flows, can be a really, and to use your word, Barbara, catalytic form of capital to really support these transitions. So when you look at high potential subscale operations, a lot of them are subscale, and more often than not have very limited cash flows. So the funding options also are quite limited for those businesses at that level of development. So actually, private equity lends itself, in particular, growth private equity can lend itself very well towards partnering with some of these businesses and offering really important funding between venture and the sort of later stage investment capability or investment markets that the business would want to access. That capital obviously needs to navigate additional risks, because it's not just a product and a service. What's important also when we think about scaling is that a lot of times you have a visionary management team of a subscale operation. So it's not just the operation itself, it's also the entire organization that needs to grow up. And that that also plays into why some of the hands-on approach that comes from private equity can be helpful in terms of supporting some of these businesses. But if you put all of that together, it creates a pretty significant opportunity for the right forms of capital with the right time horizons and the right cost of capital to focus on some of those initiatives. But it's critically important for the energy transition. I think to maybe conclude this part, probably the most widely recognized example of the importance of scale has been the journey of solar energy. In terms of just what it's done over the time period. We now sort of take it for granted that it's a relatively low cost of power, but that wasn't always the case. And the success of that is many-fold. It's not just the actual technology, so the photovoltaic technology that needed to be improved, but it's also the manufacture of panels that had to scale very significantly, the associated supply chains that had to develop, the financing options that were created, and various other associated technologies that came with that. And I think that lends itself well to a point that Francois Xavier made, that there are different, when you start to think about that ecosystem, there are different forms of capital and opportunities that play into that. So I think in summary, private equity is a very important catalyst in that transition of scaling, but it comes with its challenges. And I think you need to go in eyes open and embrace those challenges and be able to identify and price those challenges accordingly.
Thank you so much, Kjeld. I think that was very comprehensive, and I think a really good insight on how all the different elements. It's not just understanding, oh, fantastic, there's a new technology, it's competitive in this market. It's much more than that, and I think that has come out from all of you. But I think you very clearly kind of highlighting the role of equity in really being a catalyst in this space, but at the same time really thinking more holistically again, not only about the type of capital, but about the technologies, about the supply chains, I think about the organization, the management within that, the execution, the workflows. I think all that is critically important. So really going, I think, like you just said, like going inside this with very, eyes wide open and understanding what are the challenges, but then understanding that there are actually huge opportunities. But let me come to my second round, and I will ask you to be a little more concise so we can get to maybe one or two questions from our audience here. And Kimberly, let me start with you again. We've been talking obviously of different types of technologies. We do know, and it's of course also normal that many institutional investors remain cautious about early stage climate technologies. But love to hear from you a little bit more how does Gen Zero approach risk management while still backing innovations with high potential, but that still have uncertain timelines? And maybe just one point, because I really liked what you said, Kayode. I think we need to think about innovations is not only always brand new. I think sometimes it's using what is used in other markets or like maybe outside of the climate space in your area. So I really think that's an important one. How can we do better with what we have as well? But coming back to my question, how do you approach risk management in this context?
No, and thanks, Barbara. And actually, I echo a lot of what Alex mentioned earlier, like when thinking about how we diligence and get comfortable with early stage climate technologies, right? And I think a lot of it boils down to obviously an in-depth technical diligence, right? But that can only get you so far. But at the very least, right, you do need to make sure that the underlying science works, right? You really need to make sure that it really delivers climate impact, because if not, you've misallocated capital, right? You do need to actually think about whether the technology which works in a lab can actually be scaled in an outside environment and scaled easily, right? And you have to make sure that the engineering is robust, right? Beyond that, though, you have to make sure that you can do this fairly cheaply and effectively, right? The techno-economics need to make sense, right? I think you have to think about that cost trajectory as you go from pilot to first of a kind to next of a kind, right? And there needs to be a credible pathway, right, to competitive unit economics, right? And I think Alex was sharing about his portfolio company, 900.cares, right? And I think I have a similar experience with one of the investments that we made in a green cement company. And we made this investment in this US-based Colorado headquartered company earlier this year amidst everything that was happening in the US. And it's hugely CapEx intensive. And our IC was very skeptical. But in the end, we were able to actually make the investment because even though there is a limited appetite for green premiums, even though there is a limited willingness to deploy huge amounts of capital into very CapEx intensive first of a kind plants, if you are able to deliver or have conviction in a product that can be more effective, right, deliver carbon emissions reduction at a competitive price, it seems like a no-brainer, right? And so if you think about it, we were able to get comfortable with this because this particular green cement company was manufacturing a green cement that delivered 70% emissions reduction versus ordinary Portland cement, and it was doing so at roughly the same price, right, for a first of a kind plant. And with a pathway, realistically, to get to, say, 10% less even, right, at a next of a kind plant. So I mean, when presented with economics like that, then we get into thinking, but will the customer use this, right? And if you have that conviction in the unit cost, then it's easier for you to say that, yes, perhaps this is not so hard to believe, even though you have, existing fleets, that this is a drop-in solution. So why not? They can blend it with OPC. It makes sense, right? Because you have to make sure that the commercial model is viable. Because the technology alone doesn't guarantee the impact. The customers need to want to use the technology, right? And they will only want to use this if the innovation addresses a very critical bottleneck for them in a very cost-effective way, right? And all of this then comes together in how you think about the revenue growth trajectory, right? Can you really, because, lofty multiples, although not so lofty these days, but in order to justify the multiples that we frequently have to pay, you have to believe in fairly aggressive growth assumptions. And you can only do so if you believe that the company can go to market, can win customers, and can actually execute, right? Which then brings my last point, just around execution capabilities, especially in capital-intensive climate tech sectors. Nothing can go wrong, even though everything will, right? Everything will be delayed, everything will be more expensive. So you really need a management team that has a handle on it, right? And beyond just the operational capabilities of doing all of this, they need to also be thinking about so many other things. They need to be securing offtake, long-term forward offtake, right? They need to be coalescing that together with debt financing in order for it all to come together. So it's not easy, right? And so I'll end off with this point to say that beyond all the diligence that you've done on an individual asset level, that's not enough, right? So for us, we think about things also on a portfolio level. Because diligence can never mitigate the risk, right, associated with an early stage climate investment, right? There are just fundamental uncertainties that you can't diligence away or structure away, right? So we have that holistic view of a portfolio to manage the risk, right, at a portfolio level. So we diversify, obviously, within technology investments, we diversify across different sectors. So there are different sectoral tailwinds, right? Into aviation, maritime, so on and so forth, right? And we also have fundamental hedges in place as we think about our portfolio. right? We're not just solely invested into technology, we're also invested into nature investments, right? Which, I mean, it's a luxury because we have a fairly flexible mandate, but it does mean that we have an investment sort of stream into very different types of investments with very different investment characteristics and risk profile. No less risky, but different risks, right? So that's broadly how we think about risk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Camille. I think really thinking about this, again, I think comes back what we've heard from several other panelists, this more holistic view. And I think you're applying it to yourself as well, that having this portfolio view, really thinking about how can you diversify and therefore take on some of the more early stage technology risk as well, which I think is fantastic to hear. And I think certainly the execution capability is something that comes up as well from this discussion here. So, but let me also, Xavier, let me come back to you. We obviously already heard from others on, you know, why private capital is a great tool to finance and accelerate the energy transition. But I'd love, again, to come back to your specific niche and the value add that you see through the work that you do, and what would be your main arguments in that context?
Yeah, sure. Maybe starting with, you know, the long-term approach of private equity. Historically, if you look at the performance of private equity, it consistently overperform other asset classes, and more particularly listed assets. And for one main reason, which is, you know, the long-term horizon and the illiquidity premium actually we have to deliver to investors. This being said, it comes with constraints, and Kayode mentioned certain of these constraints, but private equity is about also investment discipline, and therefore we will be extremely selective. 2-3 years ago, we could see actually, you know, some excess in the market in terms of valuation. We are talking with Alex about tourists in the asset class, but it is true because debt finance was costed zero actually. So you could put a lot of leverage on projects, and so you can pay a high premium on the assets, not looking too much at the cash flows generation, and you can make mistake at the end of the day. So I think investment discipline is very important. So make sure that you have very strong recurrent cash flows on projects, putting not too much leverage on the assets, and also providing from the very beginning a liquidity plan to exit from the asset. This is very important. Private equity is not there for eternity, but we have to agree from the very beginning of the investment a liquidity path with the other asset owners. And you know, if you look at the metrics, it's between, you know, 3 to 5, 6 years. A private equity fund will stay invested into an asset. And investors in the current environment are really much looking at, you know, what we call DPI, so the distribution made by funds. And currently there is an issue in the market where there is not that much of distribution. So this is a very important metric to monitor and to work around. Private equity is also an investment style, so it was also mentioned. But when you invest in private equity, you take a strong majority or minority rights into the project of the company. You have a very hands-on approach. You create a lot of operational value, and therefore you can really decide on the strategy of, you know, your portfolio companies or your projects, and you can accompany an energy transition within your assets. So you can measure the carbon emissions at the entry. You can define an action plan to reduce the carbon emission at the end of the investment. The last point I would like to make is also how to channel more investment into this asset class, and how to channel more long-term investors into the asset class. And I think there is a big opportunity, especially in Europe, in channeling more private savings to the asset class. It's a key topic. Europe stands far behind the US, for instance. But we have a lot of vast reservoir of savings actually. But the bulk of those savings are, you know, invested into only cash or monetary assets. So if we find a way to channel more savings to the real economy, to the energy transition, then we can have more scale, which was mentioned by all the panelists. And we can also have this long-term approach, because to finance the retirement system, you need actually to have this long-term horizon. So everything is it's a win-win approach, I would say, for people, and for institutional investors, and to move forward energy transition.
Thank you so much. I think it's great to have you end on this point, because I do think we need to really concretely think about how can we get to this scale. So I think you are touching a very important point. How can we really channel more of the savings into this space? So I think that's certainly one of the key takeaways that I want everyone to recall from that one. But Alex, let me come to you, and I'd love to just go back a little bit to some of the hard to abate sectors that you're working with, like plastics or chemicals, and just understand from your end a little bit, what are the biggest levers that you see for for scaling circular economy investments in these sectors?
Well, I think first of all, when you're doing chemicals, materials, and energy in a way, you're dealing with incumbent systems like, oil that's been around for 100 plus years, refineries that have been depreciated, which are massive. So these guys can produce high volume applications at low prices, right? So you're already kind of starting at a disadvantage, right? So I think what you need to do is, and what we're seeing as well, is we're seeing a lot of, bio-based materials starting to come online. We're seeing, improving margins on recycling on the material side. We're seeing like applications on the B2C side as well, keeping those materials in the loop, right? So for example, on electronics refurbishing, that's a great one, because you get the electronics, same kind of electronics on back market at a lower price, right? So people are happy with that. So we got to keep that mindset when we're investing. We try to stay disciplined that way, but it's not simple. So I'm like, François Xavier, everybody says we're disciplined, but we're very tough on entry points. And I think, when you're going to try to attack one of these kind of established polluting sectors, you need to find the right application, right? So sometimes we look at, companies with a platform technology that can, for example, we invest in a company called Bloom Biorenewables, which is a Swiss company that basically takes biomass and is able to take out two components, lignin and hemicellulose, and valorize them into high-end chemicals, but also into plastics, right? So you're also, trying to attack maybe on the chemical side, like the specialty chemicals, the pharma side, right? Which is the stuff that people are willing to pay a premium for. And as you build up on your volume, right, you go towards, plastics and other sectors, right? So I think that's one key point, is finding those companies with those kind of nuggets. And also when you're building a first of a kind plant, right, it's risky. So, you need to be patient. You need to have the right syndicate around the table as well. You need to have people that understand the sector. And you also need people, I've never seen a project be on time and on budget. So you need to have people that understand that, and you keep a bit of cash in the reserves for that. So you just need to make sure your syndicate is solid. You also, in Europe, one advantage we have is we do have a lot of non-dilutive, so a lot of public money, so a lot of grants and stuff that can be fed into some of these plants or into these companies. And I think there's also one thing to mention, governments, I think, are doing the job. Could obviously have more grants, more tax breaks for big companies. But I think one thing that we're seeing, at least on the material side, is corporates, I think, are kind of putting a toe in it, but could be a bit more active. Like we're seeing them sign a lot of offtake agreements, but are non-binding without volumes or prices. So for these companies, they're going to build a plant not knowing really if somebody's going to offtake, right? Because they're all buying optionality, right? They're not actually taking firm commitments. So not all corporates, but we're seeing some corporates play the game, but others not. We're not going to generalize here, because, we work with a lot of corporates and they're great. Like they're really trying to get access to these technologies and help them scale. But once again, cost and performance and sustainability are key. So I think this is why chemicals and, plastics are everywhere, huh? They're in, your hospitals, your trash bags, your bottles, your cars, your planes, your clothes, they're everywhere. So you also have to attack every one of these sectors differently, right? These use cases differently. So it's a complicated problem, but I think on our side, we've built the right team. We've got the right partners to do it, but we need more people to come alongside, because we've seen also a lot of capital pull away over the last probably year or two. We've seen a lot of funds kind of back out from some of these, I would say, tougher areas. So, and energy is probably the same, similar. So
Well, thank you so much. And again, I think I really appreciate. I think what you bring, it's not only about the right technologies. It's about the right team. It's about patience, about discipline, about bringing the right people to the table, and
the right application. Like, does the customer want it? Right. You also need to talk
Right.
to the corporates and say, what are you looking for in the next 5 to 10 years? Because you could actually be shooting in the wrong direction. So you also need to know where you're going. So we work with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. We work with a lot of corporates. We know what they're looking for, at least in our sector. So we try to go and find what they're looking for, because they'll probably be buying it in a few years. So
that's great. It's not only top down. We know what you want. We need to listen to what actually the consumers want. Thank you so much, Alex. Kayode, let me come back to you before we're going to a couple of questions and then a final round. Just trying again to understand, and again, you obviously have a very global perspective, but what you see looking forward a little bit, what is the next wave of private equity opportunities for driving decarbonizations? And I think we've been talking a little bit about barriers, but maybe some specific barriers in that context would be great.
Sure. Look, I think one of the things that is certainly true for climate investing is it's growing up, right? So it's people have spoken about climate 1.0 and 2.0. So there hasn't been a shortage of early stage capital really sort of starting to mobilize things, but some of those things are now really starting to break out. I mentioned solar before as I think the paradigm example of a technology that ultimately became a solution, but sits on a lot of pillars. And what I mean by that is there are different components now. And I think what we're going to see going forward is that a rich early stage venture ecosystem has started to fuel a growing and expanding growth system, and that's going to continue to push both new and existing technologies forward. But what I see as a big opportunity going forward is that in addition to those specific technologies or products and services is the supporting infrastructure and services that are underpinning that to scale. So what that means is that in addition to these opportunities, the ecosystem itself needs to scale to be able to do that. And this is a really important distinction, because what it means is it starts to open up the aperture for other forms of capital and capital cost. So if you think around the characteristics of early stage investing or growth investing, very different from infrastructure type investing or lending, right? But what you really need is you need those big pools of capital to also be able to come in. And what I mean by that is you can look at things in these pillars like infrastructure. So what does that mean? Well, for example, batteries or transmission or grid upgrades or pipelines or storage or metering or monitoring technologies in the home. Those are all adjacencies sometimes to the technologies that are now proving to be solutions. The other thing that is often, or not often, but can be overlooked, are the services surrounding that. So whether it's maintenance services or even just the workforce. One of the things that is interesting is that there's a potential energy workforce gap that's coming just as a result of the supply-demand imbalances. And then, as I've mentioned before, the supply chains, right, which also need to catch up. And a more recent example of that, that certainly is evident in the market, has been this growing demand in data or for data. And that is obviously growing very significantly as a result of many different factors, but it is just growing very significantly, and that means that the consequential demand for energy is also increasing quite significantly. And ideally, we would want that energy to come from lower polluting energy, if possible, to meet that data demand. But those are some of those adjacencies, and in order for that reality to catalyze itself, there's going to be more supporting infrastructure. So how do you generate the electricity? How is it transported? Where is it stored? What are the implications for even advisory firms around planning and regulation and supply chain? So again, those are, I think, aspects that I get excited about, because I think it increases the aperture. And I would say that as the solutions graduate from VC to growth, the opportunity for supporting adjacencies is going to increase quite significantly.
Thank you so much, Kayode. I think that's super helpful, and I think this is how we again have to think ahead, and how can you really go from the kind of small pilots from VC into kind of the real growth space. So I think I want to highlight particular the point that you made around demand for data. I think that's certainly something we see a lot as well, and I think this is something where it comes a little bit back to Kimberly's point at the beginning on how do you make sure that you see high integrity credits. But I think having better data around all that can create certainty, I think is really important. I think we have one question actually, Kayode, for you, and I think then we'll go to a quick round from everyone just before we close. And apologies to those who won't be able to come in here. But Kayode, we have a question on you that private markets are often described as patient capital, but obviously there is an issue with patient capital basically being, exiting the market like between 7 to 12 years. So I think there's a question on how can private equity and infrastructure investors balance these long-term returns with the urgency that we have in accelerating decarbonization. So maybe a quick answer from you on that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are many ways to define patient capital, but what it really means most of the time is there's a time horizon for that capital to be absorbed by the business and to start to generate a return for the investors that have put that forward. And also one of the important considerations is there's no, certainly on an equity perspective, rarely an interim requirement to service cash towards that investment. So in other words, there is typically a 5 to 7 year window in which the business is able to utilize that capital and show a return. But it's also an ecosystem, which means that to the extent that that is a successful situation, then that capital has to go back and be recycled to be able to go elsewhere. So I would say that in the context of especially first of a kind, which is why you need to both think about the longevity of the capital, but also the nature of the capital. So there's no point in taking, infrastructure capital that's looking at, I don't know, 10 years of history and trying to fund a first of a kind project with that. That's where you have to go for growth. By the same token, if you already have significant scale and you're looking to launch a separate new factory, and you already got 50 of those and you've got history, then you go to an infrastructure investor who has a lower cost of capital. So it's a combination of both the nature of the capital and then what that partnership looks like. But in most instances, there's a balance between the amount of time that investors will wait for the business to showcase the returns, and in some instances it works, in some instances it doesn't.
Great, thank you so much, Kayode. That's super helpful. So we are almost at the end, and I do acknowledge all the additional comments also in the chat. Thanks so much. And Maria, I think for me, just data is not only data centers, it's a broader kind of access to data to inform investment decisions as well. But very good point. But let me do a very quick fire round here to every one of you. Just very quickly, what is the one concrete action, the one investment opportunity, or any other takeaway that you would like our audience to leave with today? And Kimberly, let me start with you.
So we have to be really fast. Okay, I think from a policy level, I think carbon taxes would really, really help price carbon. And then once you have that, let the free market take over. But maybe that's controversial, but yeah.
Good. We need clear signals here. That's fantastic. François-Xavier, let me go to you.
It's time to scale. So channel more long-term capital, maybe using also the savings to accelerate and scale energy transition.
Fantastic. Savings. Let's make sure that's a takeaway. Alex, over to you.
So I just want to say I completely agree with what you say, François-Xavier, on savings, by the way. I think there's a huge pool in Europe that's sleeping. I think on a plastic side, I would say a global plastics treaty would be my wish, because that's something that we've been missing, and it unfortunately didn't work out in Geneva this summer. But I'm hoping that, different countries come together, at least for a minimum framework. We have great policy in Europe and in other places, but having a global framework would be great for the planet.
Much needed. Fully agree with you on that, Alex. Kayode.
Yeah, and I'll just keep it brief. Just more catalytic capital that comes in and really supports some of these great potential companies to scale, because that's what the market really needs. Once a project is up and running and beautiful, there is no shortage of capital. There is no shortage of capital to go in. But it's really that catalytic capital that allows these businesses and these entrepreneurs and these companies to transition. I think we need more of that.
Fantastic. Couldn't agree more. So very briefly, just let me just try to summarize my key takeaways from this fantastic conversation. I think what we have heard here today is that there is progress, but certainly it's not enough. And I think, as François-Xavier said, we all know that public sources will not be enough to actually, make sure that we can accelerate the transition. So we need private capital. I think it's not science fiction that came out from this discussion very clearly. There's lots of pilots, lots of examples out there, but we don't need to go from pilot to scale, thinking obviously about cost and performance. So it's not a nice to have. This is something that needs to make full business sense. And I think we have seen many ways of doing that. I think it is about thinking and not only about technology, but about a more holistic view where you look at execution capabilities, at planning public and private, at policy of supply chain, but also listening really to the consumers. And I think ultimately it is about really making sure that we are both doing a clear understanding of where we need to go top down, but also listening bottom up of what are the needs in the market. I think this is ultimately a huge opportunity. Equity is a catalytic form of capital. And I think what Coyote just said, we need more of this catalytic capital to really accelerate and be kind of the driver for the transition is what we hopefully will be able to accomplish all together. And just maybe ending on, I think it takes discipline, it takes real integrity, and I think it takes the right people on the ground and around the table. And I certainly have seen that this webinar here has shown that we have had the right people in this discussion here. And with that, I'm handing over, Christine, to you. And thank you so much, everyone, for a great discussion.
Thank you. Can I just say hi to my
you.
mom who's on the call? Hi, Mom.
And just segueing, Mom is the right person to have on the call, but a huge and sincere thank you to each of you and all of you from the Building Bridges Foundation. This is just another very important topic that we'll be addressing in person in 3 weeks in Geneva. So please, please, please look at our program, Private Markets Front and Center, and the investment opportunities. Just to mention, there'll be a survey that will appear right after this call. So please complete it. It's very important for us to get your reflection so we can build upon that for a future webinar series. And finally, huge thank you to everyone. We have one more fantastic private markets webinar coming up on the 30th of October that will delve into emerging markets, specifically Africa lens, and the huge potential investment opportunities there. So a huge thank you to everyone. And we look forward to see you building bridges in Geneva in person and with our future work streams.
Thanks so
Bye,
much.
everyone.